I want to start this one by being completely upfront with you, because what you're about to hear is not what the title of this video and 100 other articles online would have you believe. Search, "Do truck drivers get divorced more?" and you'll find the same claim repeated everywhere. Truckers have it figured out. The distance makes the marriage stronger. Some blogs even cite a statistic, without a source, claiming trucker marriages outlast the national average. Type the question into a forum, and you'll find a driver's wife insisting it's true, right next to another driver's wife saying the job took everything from her marriage. Nobody seems to agree, and almost nobody is citing an actual source. I went looking for where that statistic actually comes from. It doesn't exist. What actually exists is the opposite. Multiple independent estimates from industry researchers, from trucking forums where drivers and their spouses talk to each other directly, from analysis of census demographic data, put the divorce rate for truck drivers somewhere between 36 and 75%, depending on the methodology. That's not lower than the national average of roughly 35 to 50%. In nearly every credible estimate, it's higher, sometimes dramatically higher.
So why does this myth exist at all? Why do so many people, including drivers themselves, repeat the idea that this lifestyle somehow protects a marriage? Because buried inside a mostly false claim is one real, fascinating piece of psychology. And once you understand it, you'll understand something true about distance, connection, and why some couples actually do get stronger from the exact thing that destroys most relationships. Let's separate the myth from the truth, where the real numbers actually land. Let's deal with the hard data first, because this matters and it deserves to be said clearly. A widely cited breakdown using Census Bureau demographic data calculated a truck driver divorce rate of 36.9%, meaningfully above commonly cited national averages, which tend to sit somewhere between 35 and 45%, depending on the data source and time period measured. Other sources, including discussions among drivers themselves on industry forums, cite figures as high as 70 to 75%, specifically for long-haul drivers, though those numbers come from anecdotal community estimates rather than formal academic studies, and should be read as a sense of lived experience rather than a precise statistic. Either way you slice it, the data points the same direction. Away from home for weeks at a time, on an unpredictable schedule, doing physically and mentally exhausting work. This is, by almost every measure, a hard environment for a marriage to survive in. One driver on a trucking forum put it about as bluntly as anyone could. "The truck destroyed my marriage several years ago and has destroyed every option of a relationship since." Beyond the raw distance, there's a layered set of pressures that compound on each other. Missed birthdays, missed school events, missed ordinary Tuesday night dinners that don't sound significant individually, but accumulate into a spouse who feels like they're raising a family essentially alone. Financial stress for drivers paid by the mile, where a slow week directly threatens the household budget, in a way salaried jobs don't. Physical and mental exhaustion that doesn't disappear the moment a driver walks through the front door. Many spouses describe a homecoming period of irritability and decompression that eats into the very limited time they have together. None of this is unique to trucking in isolation, but trucking tends to deliver all of it simultaneously, which is part of why the divorce numbers run as high as they do. That's the real baseline. Trucking is genuinely hard on relationships. Anyone telling you otherwise, without data to back it up, is repeating something comforting rather than something true. So, where did the myth actually come from? Here's where it gets interesting. Because myths this persistent don't usually come from nowhere. There's almost always a real phenomenon underneath them, just misapplied. The phenomenon underneath this one is real, well-documented psychological research on long-distance relationships, Research that has nothing to do with trucking specifically, but that gets borrowed and misapplied to explain why some trucker marriages survive against the odds. A 2013 study from researchers at Cornell University and the City University of Hong Kong found something genuinely counterintuitive. Couples separated by distance often reported higher levels of intimacy than couples who saw each other constantly. The mechanism researchers identified involves a few overlapping effects. Partners apart from each other tend to idealize one another more, filling in absence with an emotionally generous mental picture of the other person rather than the friction of daily proximity. Limited contact tends to be used more intentionally. Calls and messages get filled with genuine emotional disclosure rather than the logistical noise of daily life. Who's picking up groceries, whose turn it is to do dishes. And the anticipation of reunion creates a recurring cycle of genuine excitement that constant cohabitation simply doesn't generate. The National Communication Association, summarizing decades of work on this topic, found that people in long-distance relationships tend to report being more in love and more satisfied than people in geographically close relationships, at least while the distance continues. There's a real psychological mechanism here, and it's not a myth. So when someone says trucker marriages are stronger because of the distance, they're not making something up out of thin air. They're taking a real research finding about distance and intimacy and applying it to a context, trucking, where, on average, it does not hold up. Distance can intensify a relationship that has a strong foundation. It does not create one. And for a profession with this much physical and financial stress layered on top of the distance, the intensifying effect of separation gets overwhelmed, for most couples, by everything else working against the marriage. If you appreciate a channel willing to actually check a popular claim instead of just repeating it, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of myth versus reality breakdown we do here every week. Now let's talk about the marriages that genuinely do make it, because that part is real and it's worth understanding. The marriages that actually survive, and why. Even with a divorce rate above the national average, a meaningful number of trucking marriages do last for decades. The forum threads researched for this video are full of exactly that. Alongside the broken ones, there are drivers who've been married 30, 40, even 50 years, still on the road the entire time. What separates those marriages isn't luck. It's a specific combination of factors that show up again and again when you look closely. First, financial stability changes the entire equation. Trucking, particularly for experienced owner-operators, can provide solid income without requiring a 4-year degree or decades of career building. A marriage under less financial strain has one less major source of conflict working against it, and financial stress is consistently one of the top predictors of divorce across every profession, not just trucking. Second, the couples who make it tend to have figured out the same intentional communication pattern that research on long-distance relationships identifies. Scheduled calls. Real conversation, not just logistics. Making the homecoming itself a genuine event rather than just an interruption to routine. Couples who treat the time together as precious, rather than resentfully limited, are doing, intuitively, exactly what the Cornell research found successful long-distance couples doing deliberately. Third, and this one is less discussed but shows up constantly in driver testimony, some marriages benefit from what you might call structured independence. Two people who are both comfortable with autonomy, who don't need constant togetherness to feel secure in the relationship, experience long-haul trucking very differently than two people who do need that. For some couples, weeks apart followed by intense, focused time together is genuinely closer to their natural relational rhythm than a standard 9-to-5 arrangement would be. That's not the majority, but it's real, and it explains why some marriages don't just survive this lifestyle, they seem to thrive inside it specifically. The team driving workaround. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding.
Because it's a direct, practical response to everything we've just covered. And it's becoming more common across the industry for exactly that reason. Team driving, where a husband and wife drive the same truck together full-time, has grown specifically because some couples looked at the standard model, one person on the road, one person at home, and decided the distance itself was the actual threat, not the job. So they removed it. This isn't a small, fringe choice. A meaningful and growing share of owner-operator teams are couples who made a deliberate decision to never be the long-distance trucking marriage in the first place. They eat together, sleep in the same cab, split the driving, and effectively run a small two-person business from the road. From a relationship standpoint, this sidesteps the entire distance equation. There's no idealizing absence because there's no absence. There's no scheduled call replacing real conversation because the real conversation is happening live, all day, every day. Of course, this creates its own challenge. Now you're testing a relationship's ability to handle nearly unlimited proximity instead of separation, which is its own kind of pressure most marriages never have to face. But for couples who choose this path and make it work, it's a striking real-world demonstration of the same underlying point. Trucking itself doesn't determine the outcome of a marriage. The structure a couple builds around the realities of the job does. Talk to long-term team-driving couples, and you'll hear a version of the same idea repeated constantly. That doing this together, rather than apart, turned what could have been the thing that ended their marriage into the thing that defines it. Not because the job got easier, because they refused to let distance be the variable working against them. What this actually tells us. So here's the honest synthesis, and it's more useful than either the myth or a flat, "trucking destroys marriages" headline would be. Distance is not inherently destructive to a relationship, and it's not inherently protective either. The research is clear that absence can intensify genuine connection when a couple already has the underlying foundation and actively does the work of intentional communication during the separation. But trucking adds enormous additional stressors on top of distance alone. Financial unpredictability for many drivers, physical exhaustion, irregular schedules that make even scheduled calls difficult to maintain consistently, and the sheer duration of separation, often weeks rather than days. For couples without a strong foundation already in place, that combination of stressors typically overwhelms whatever intensifying effect the distance alone might create. Which is exactly why the overall divorce statistics for the profession sit above the national average, rather than below it. For couples who do have that foundation, who communicate intentionally, who've built financial stability, who are temperamentally suited to independence within commitment, the same distance that destroys other marriages can genuinely become the thing that keeps theirs feeling alive. They're not protected by the job. They're succeeding despite it, using exactly the psychological mechanism the myth borrowed and oversimplified. So the title you clicked on isn't true, at least not in the simple way it's usually repeated online. Trucker marriages don't statistically outlast everyone else's. The data says the opposite, and that deserves to be said honestly rather than buried under a more comfortable story. But hidden inside that false claim is something real about how distance actually works in human relationships, that it can be either corrosive or clarifying, almost entirely depending on what a couple brings to the separation in the first place. The truckers whose marriages survive 30 or 40 years on the road aren't statistical outliers because the lifestyle protected them. They survived because they figured out, often without ever reading a single study on it, the exact thing researchers eventually proved in a lab, that absence makes the heart grow fonder, only when two people choose, deliberately, to keep reaching across it. If this changed how you think about a myth you'd probably heard before, let me know in the comments. And if you want more of this, the real story instead of the comfortable one, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.